There had been one more advantage to putting Zarakonar in the audience chamber, aside from appealing to a sense of superiority. Of all the rooms in the palace, the audience chamber was the one in which Gavarax had put the most effort into making people believe that he belonged. Intention mattered in magic. Gav knew that Gavarax had spent years convincing people people in that room, that he belonged in that room, to the point that the room itself was convinced. Gav wasn't sure what Zarakonar ever needed. Wasn't sure that Zarakonar ever needed to put that much effort into trying to get people to believe him. Zarakonar was scary as a fact of being rather than carefully maintained facade. Or at least Zarakonar's facade was better constructed than Gavarax could have ever dreamed. Zarakonar had built terrifyingly solid wards to let him know that if anything entered the room. What Gav had to do was convince the room itself that he was part of it, to the extent that the room would convince the wards. He gathered the scraps he would need, each of them a blow to his dignity. He put on the robes with the flames, which Beetle had stubbornly kept. They were rather bedraggled. He grabbed one of the thrice-damned torches. He stopped by the workshop long enough to lop off the tip of a squid tentacle. He was part of the facade of the castle that the castle had built to He was part of the facade the castle had been built to maintain. He was part of the castle. He was a shadow cast by the torches, a figment, nothing that would count as an intruder. He belonged here, and everything that belonged here was below notice. He burned the squid tentacle in the torch, using the ashy grease to coat his face and arms. He took a deep breath. Elsewhere in the castle, Valvina was leading Zarakonar up to the princess's cell to test whether she still met the requirements for the spell. It was time. I once again did the thing where I was really close to the end of the chapter, didn't realize it, so I stopped. So we're going to start chapter 13, because I don't want to stop yet. I can't tell. What's the time at? 2 minutes. We're at 2 minutes. Okay. Let's see if I can get that to stay back. Okay, chapter 13. He gently pushed open the door and edged into the room. The first and easiest trap would have been to ward the lintel. He tried to think throne-roomy thoughts. The grease on his skin reminded the room of his belonging. He was all the way inside. The darkened room was dimming further. He had set something off. He froze. His head spun, and then he realized that he was holding his breath. He forced himself to take one deep, quiet breath, and then another. Blood rushed to his head, and after a few more breaths it cleared. He was being an idiot, and he couldn't afford to be an idiot. He crossed the space, one slow footstep at a time. It wasn't actually that grand a chamber, but he had never fully appreciated how long the walk to the foot of the dais must be for visitors. He had to keep reminding himself to keep breathing. His ears strained, listening for voices or movement. He hadn't dared set traps of his own to warn him if Zarakonar came back early. He hoped Valvina and Alicia were putting on a good show. It was so dark. How was he going to find anything? He could light a torch, but did the light belong there? Not at this time of night. He would have to fumble his way through on what little night vision he had. Now, where would he put a priceless spell that he did not want to lose, but he did not want to carry around with him all the time? The bed loomed on the dais, even more imposing than it had been in his bedroom. If Zarakonar hadn't warded the room, he might have warded the bed. But here, too, was a place Gav belonged. He did his best to shove down his loathing of the ugly thing. He had slept here every night for years. He belonged here. The bed recognized him. He urged the hulking monstrosity. Where might a book or a scroll be hidden under a pillow? He bit his lip and slid a hand under the sack of feathers. Nothing. No zap, no tingle, no book. Maybe under the mattress itself. He paused once more to listen. Was that a sound of footsteps? No, just his heart. He heaved the mattress, trying not to disturb the covers too much, and ran his hand along the ropes the feather tick rested on. Nothing. He eased the mattress back down and smoothed the covers back into place. Think, damn it. Where would someone hide something in this room? If he were a powerful wizard and wanted to hide something in a room with almost no furniture, what would he do for a hiding spot? Make his own, of course. The walls were solid stone. It would take a profligate use of magic to create a hole in one. But the dais was a wooden platform. The question was, did Zarakonar just magic it open and magic it closed again? Or had he created a door? If he had magicked it shut, the situation was hopeless. Gav would have to blow a hole in the platform, and while Zarakonar might have the skill to subtly open and shut the access point, Gav did not. Gav wished he had someone to pray to, but he no longer felt on speaking terms with the dark gods, and he doubted the light ones would listen. Or would they, if it was on behalf of someone else? Please, he thought, not for me, but for Alicia, and Tyrwin, and Orla, and Garabedal, and Throck, and Serico. They deserve better than this. If someone is listening, help me so I can help them. He ran his hands along the sides of the steps up to the dais, trying to remember if there were visible joins in the wood. He had no idea. Why would he even look for such a thing? He'd always been too busy stomping and looming and terrorizing. If he survived, he would need to start paying more attention to minor architectural details. There was a gap. But had it always been there? From the hints of light coming in from under the door, he could barely see the thing. He traced the line to a corner, across, another corner, up, another corner, across, and he had back to where he started. This wasn't a join. There was no reason to have a rectangle cut into the wood. He hooked a nail into the crack, and it gave it just the tiniest pull. There was a resistance, but the resistance of rough-cut wood on wood, not a clasp or anything. He worked it loose. The rectangle of wood fell onto the stone floor with a clatter that echoed shockingly loud in the empty room. Gav froze, and then he forced himself to move. If anyone had heard that, they were going to burst through the door anyway. There wasn't anywhere left to hide. He needed to concentrate on speed. He leaned down, trying not to block what light he had with his head. Yes, there it was, a few loose sheets of paper piled on top of each other, and behind it, a ceramic jar. Part of the room. He was part of the room. The hole hadn't been particularly cleverly constructed, just a thin line burned into the wood, and then the piece wedged back in place. He hoped Zarakonar had been equally hasty when hiding his objects. If he put a spell to note that they'd been moved, for example, well, Gav would just have to risk it. He reached hesitantly with his left hand. If it were trapped, he'd rather have it snap on the non-dominant one. Well, he'd rather not have anything snap on any hand, but there was a limit to how much time he could use being careful. The papers slipped out easily enough, though, without anything terrible happening. For once, he had thought ahead. He couldn't just take the papers, not without Zarakonar noticing the next day when he went to retrieve them. It was far too dark to read them. But he had just the thing. He pulled the absorption papers out of his own belt pouch. Pressed gently and firmly against a written document, it would absorb just the tiniest trace of ink. The old one would be a tiny bit fainter for the loss, but not really enough to be noticed. Meanwhile, given a few minutes, the absorbed ink would cause the opposite surface of the absorption paper to bloom with a fully readable copy. He laid out the first sheet, working his way methodically across. How long could Valvina keep Zarakonar busy? Maybe Alicia would manage some delays of her own. One sheet finished. He laid it aside and started the next. He wished that he had time to warn her, but he had told her that he was seeking Valvina's help with a distraction, so hopefully she would figure it out. He would have worried that she'd never forgive him for the indignity, but he already had enough things to never forgive him for. What was one more? Ears straining, he finished the rest of the sheets and tucked the copies back into his belt pouch. He carefully slipped the pages back where they had been. But what was in the canister? He paused. Still no footsteps. Did he dare take a moment to satisfy his curiosity? Then again, if it was something important enough for Zarakonar to try to hide it, could he afford not to? He pulled the jar out, opened it with shaking hands, barely daring to hope. It was full of coarse powder. No, it couldn't be. But then, why not? How much easier to taunt Gav with his memories, or cajole him, or threaten him if Zarakonar brought them with him. Unless they weren't real. A decoy, perhaps? But then why hide them? Echoing down the stairs came the sounds of feet, murmuring of Valvina's voice. He had a few seconds as they finished coming down the spiral stone stairs to put the wooden rectangle back in place and get out. Take the memories or leave them? He wanted them. He wanted them so badly that his teeth ached. They would hurt, he realized now. Whatever past had created a man like Gavarax, it could not have been pleasant. Even the things Gavarax would have considered pleasant, Gav wasn't sure he would enjoy. But he would understand. He would know who he really had been. If there was some justification for Gavarax's rage, maybe if he knew what lay down those channels in the first place, those patterns of thought, it would be easier to carve new ones. And that was worth anything. Almost anything. Because if the jar was missing, Zarakonar would know. How big a problem would that be? It would depend on what was written on these papers, on whether they would need to surprise him, on how angry he would be to be thwarted. Gav could take the memories and run, of course, and maybe steal Valvina's carpet. It was everything he had originally wanted. The whole stealing the papers thing had always been a long shot, and there was no guarantee it would help. Who was he kidding? Alicia was never going to forgive him, no matter what he told her. What did he owe them, really? He'd never get this chance again. If someone unlocked her collar, would she even give him a second thought before she fled? He was so tired of indecision. Was he really going to give up his only chance to find some certainty for the sake of people, of a woman, who would always hate him no matter how hard he tried? The footsteps were closer. Now or never. With a grimace, he shoved the jar back. The wood caught for a moment. As he tried to put it back, he nearly dropped it. Somehow, he wedged it back into place. Back across the floor as quickly as he could run on soft feet. He slipped out the door, closing it softly. They were nearly at the bottom of the spiral stairs. 3 steps to an alcove. He pressed himself into the shadow, sucked in his gut, held his breath ridiculously. The doors opened. Footsteps went in. The doors closed. Footsteps, presumably Valvina's, led away. There was no outcry. He waited, wondering if Zarakonar would check on his hidey hole. He couldn't hear anything. How long should he wait? It would be better not to be here at all if the disturbance were discovered. Could he blame it on another hero? He crept away, a burglar in his own home. Back up the stairs. He didn't start to breathe normally until he was halfway back to the cell. Why hadn't he taken the jar of memories? No longer needing to tiptoe, he found himself stomping down the hall, the hard stone sending shocks up his feet. Was it courage or cowardice? Did he think he was some kind of hero? He had seen how heroes ended. Well, who did he think he was anyway? It wasn't like he was ever going to know now. He had wanted to tell her, he realized. He still wanted to find that there was some justification for Gavarax's actions. a suitably tragic backstory he could lay at Alicia's feet so she could understand him and pity him and maybe forgive him. Because if she couldn't forgive him, how could he forgive himself? Because maybe there had been an excuse. Maybe once upon a time he had been a sweet, innocent kid, and everyone had been innocent once, hadn't they? And something terrible had happened, or maybe many things that explained everything, and then all he had to do was find his way back, and then he could move forward. But what if the justifications Gavarax had for acting the way he did were just that? Justifications. What if he found that the memories didn't make things better, but made them worse? He was a coward, he decided. He just wasn't sure if what he was afraid of was Zarakonar or himself. Back down the hall to the cell. Just checking on things, he said vaguely to the guards and shut the door behind him. Well? She had been pacing from the look of things. I found something, he started. How mad was she? Are you all right? That's on the list of things you don't have a right to ask about right now, she spat. She was mad. What did you find? I'm not sure, he had to admit, grateful for a subject change. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. He took the handful of crumpled papers from his belt pouch and smoothed them out. The faint text was not easy to make out, and the handwriting had not been the clearest to begin with. Well? She asked. Give me a minute, he snapped, and bring the lantern closer. He puzzled through, narrating as he went. All right, so this first part describes the diagram we'll need to lay out on the floor. Chalk. That's good. Chalk as opposed to what? Fiari asked. Blood, Alicia said flatly. She had had time to read at least some of the spells she had organized for him. It sounded like. Diagram. That's a lot of diagram. Looks like it'll take a good chunk of the afternoon to draw this properly. What if you don't draw it properly? Asked Alicia. What if you, or we, make a mistake or two on purpose? Gav was getting to that part. He winced and finally got enough of a toehold on the topic for his bits of memory to kick in. Oh, we don't want to do that. No? He looked her straight in the eye, willing her to believe him. Not that she had a lot of reason to, but if she didn't, they were all going to die a horrible, horrible death. Because the diagram is the part that protects us. The summoning chant directs who we call. The sacrifices ensure that the summoned will do our bidding. But the diagram is what keeps what we summoned from not doing our bidding. What would it do instead? Well, in this case, we're trying to raise, I'm not saying it, one of the ancient gods of the outer darkness. And what he would like to do, from what anyone knows, is rip through this reality and devour as much of it as he possibly can. Oh, she looked suitably chastened. Not just the people who summoned him, Gav continued, looking at both of them. It was really, really important they understand this part. He did not need a would-be hero deciding that it would be no great loss if a few dark wizards lost their souls. Depending on how much leeway the incorrect diagram gives, he might tear a hole in the fabric of reality the size of the room, or the castle, or maybe even the surrounding kingdom if he gets enough momentum going. What do you mean, a hole? Alicia asked, looking unsure as to whether to think he was being hyperbolic. And that's where we're going to stop.